Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into a story that's sending shockwaves through global geopolitics. Picture this. While America's wielding tariffs like a weapon, one of its closest allies just made a power move that nobody saw coming. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney just returned from Beijing with a trade deal that's turning heads around the world. And here's the kicker. This isn't just about canola oil and electric cars. This is about the fracturing of old alliances, the birth of new partnerships, and what some are calling a new world order. So grab your coffee, hit that subscribe button, and let's unpack how Trump's tariff chaos just pushed Canada straight into China's arms. Let's start with the facts. After years of frozen relations, Chinese President Xi Jinping and Canadian PM Mark Carney just announced a major breakthrough in Beijing. And the numbers are staggering. China's slashing tariffs on Canadian canola oil from a crushing 85% down to just 15% by March 1st. For those who don't know, Canada is one of the world's largest canola producers, and this tariff was absolutely devastating their farmers. We're talking about an industry worth billions. In return, Canada's reducing tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles to 6.1%, the so-called most favored nation rate. Now, before you think Canada's opening the floodgates, there's a catch. They're capping Chinese EV imports at 49,000 vehicles. That's to protect Canadian automakers from being overwhelmed by cheap Chinese electric cars. But wait, there's more. Canadian lobsters, crabs, and peas are also getting tariff relief. These might sound like small details, but for the communities that depend on these exports, this is life-changing. This is Carney's first visit to China as Prime Minister, and actually, he's the first Canadian leader to visit China in nearly a decade. The last one was Justin Trudeau back in 2017, and we'll get to why that's significant in a moment. But here's what makes this really interesting. Xi Jinping himself called this a turnaround in their relationship. When you have the leader of China publicly celebrating a deal with a Western nation, you know something big is happening. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room, Donald Trump. Carney didn't explicitly say this is all Trump's fault, but he might as well have. When asked about the deal, he talked about how Canada's relationship with China has been more predictable in recent months, and how he found talks with Beijing realistic and respectful. Read between the lines, folks. He's contrasting China with the United States. Trump's on-again, off-again tariffs have created massive uncertainty for Canada. Remember, the US is Canada's largest trading partner by a huge margin. When your biggest customer starts threatening you with tariffs one day, then backing off the next, then threatening again, you start looking for other options. And that's exactly what Carney's doing. He's been actively trying to diversify Canadian trade away from dependence on the US. It's a strategy born out of necessity. Think about the irony here for a second. Trump has positioned himself as tough on China, right? He's been waging a trade war, calling them out, trying to decouple American business from Chinese manufacturing. But his aggressive tactics toward America's own allies have just pushed Canada, one of the US's closest partners, into a major trade agreement with Beijing. This is what political scientists call blowback. Trump's trying to isolate China, but instead, he's isolating America. Carney even said at one point that the world has changed dramatically, and how Canada positions itself will shape our future for decades to come. That's not casual dinner conversation. That's a prime minister announcing a fundamental shift in his country's foreign policy. Here's where things get really interesting. Canada isn't alone. Xi Jinping has been on a charm offensive, positioning China as the stable, reliable partner in an increasingly chaotic world. And it's working. In recent weeks, the South Korean president visited Beijing. The Irish prime minister visited Beijing. The UK prime minister is expected to visit soon. So is the German chancellor. See the pattern? These are all traditional US allies or partners, and they're all making pilgrimages to China right now. Why? Because Trump's unpredictability has created an opening, and Xi is exploiting it brilliantly. While Washington swings between aggression and isolation, Beijing is offering win-win partnerships, as they like to say. During Carney's visit, both countries signed multiple agreements on energy and trade cooperation. Carney met with senior executives from major Chinese companies, including electric vehicle battery makers and energy giants. This wasn't just a photo-op diplomatic visit. This was serious business. China is already Canada's second-largest trading partner, But the gap between them and the US is enormous. What we're seeing now is Canada trying to close that gap, to create more balance, to have options. And here's something that should worry Washington. The deal could lead to more Chinese investments in Canada. That's right, more Chinese money, more Chinese influence, right on America's doorstep. To understand why this meeting is so significant, we need to rewind to 2018. That's when everything fell apart. At the request of the United States, Canada arrested Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei, the Chinese tech giant. The US wanted her extradited on fraud charges. China saw this as Canada doing America's dirty work. Days later, China arrested two Canadian citizens, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, on espionage charges. Critics called it hostage diplomacy, retaliation for Meng's arrest. China denied it, but the timing was suspicious, to say the least. All three were eventually released in 2021, but the damage was done. Relations between Canada and China were in the freezer. Trade suffered. Dialogue stopped. Trust evaporated. Then came the tariff wars. In 2024, Canada imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, following the US lead. Beijing hit back with tariffs on over $2 billion worth of Canadian farm and food products. Chinese imports of Canadian goods dropped 10% in 2025. So when we say this is a breakthrough, we mean it. These two countries have been at each other's throats for years. The fact that they're now shaking hands and signing deals is genuinely remarkable. Interestingly, Michael Kovrig himself, one of the detained Canadians, wrote on social media ahead of this meeting that it shouldn't just be about warming ties, but also about managing leverage. He warned that Chinese negotiators are extremely adroit, calculating, and always looking for leverage, and that engagement needs to be handled with discipline. That's a former hostage warning his own prime minister to be careful. That tells you something about how complex and delicate this relationship is. Now, Carney isn't naive. He knows who he's dealing with. During his visit, he made it clear that Canada doesn't agree with China on everything. He told reporters he discussed red lines with Xi, including human rights concerns, worries about election interference, and the need for guardrails in the relationship. When asked about China's human rights record, Carney gave a pretty pragmatic answer. We take the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. That's diplomat speak for. Yeah, we know they're authoritarian, but we still need to do business. He also mentioned that issues like Chinese claims over Taiwan and the imprisonment of Hong Kong pro-democracy figure Jimmy Lai came up in discussions. And he emphasized that with countries that don't share the same values, Canada will engage in a narrower, more specific manner. Translation, we'll trade with you, but we're not becoming best friends. Carney also made a point about communication style. He said Canada and China have different systems, which limits their cooperation, but to have an effective relationship, they need direct conversations. We don't grab a megaphone and have the conversations that way, he said. Again, contrast that with Trump's style of diplomacy by tweet, calling out countries publicly, making threats on social media. Carney's basically saying, we prefer quiet diplomacy to loud confrontation. But here's the uncomfortable truth. There are about 100 Canadians imprisoned in China right now, according to Canadian media. Human rights groups wanted Carney to make this a centerpiece of his visit. He acknowledged it, but clearly, the trade deal took priority. That's the eternal tension in international relations. Do you prioritize your values or your interests? Carney's betting that engagement, even with an authoritarian regime, is better than isolation. So what does all this mean for the rest of us? First, it signals that Trump's strategy of using tariffs to bully allies and punish rivals might be backfiring spectacularly. Instead of bringing countries closer to the US, it's pushing them away. Second, China is winning the narrative battle. While the US looks chaotic and unreliable, China is positioning itself as the responsible adult in the room. That's a remarkable achievement for an authoritarian state. Third, this could set a precedent. If Canada can successfully diversify away from US dependence, other countries might follow. We could be watching the slow erosion of American economic hegemony in real time. Former Canadian diplomat Colin Robertson called this visit a reset of a relationship that may be modest in ambition, but much more realistic about what we can reasonably obtain. That's diplomatic language for, we're lowering our expectations and focusing on what works. Carney himself talked about this being part of a new world order. Those are heavy words. He later added that the multilateral system, the rules-based international order that the U.S. helped build after World War II, has been eroded, to use a polite term, or undercut. Who's doing the eroding? He didn't say, but we can guess. Look, whether you think this deal is brilliant or dangerous probably depends on your perspective. If you're a Canadian canola farmer, you're celebrating. If you're a U.S. policymaker, you're probably worried. But one thing is clear, the world is changing. Old alliances are being tested. New partnerships are forming. And the unipolar moment, where America dominated everything, is giving way to something more multipolar, more complex, and frankly, more unpredictable. The question now is, will other countries follow Canada's lead? And how will Washington respond? This is a story we'll be following closely, so make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. Drop a comment below. Do you think Canada made the right move, or are they making a deal with the devil? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.